All right, we have the second part of Beau's episode coming up right now, so sit tight. I'm Justin the Addiction Guy. Thank you, self actualizing listeners. Hope you enjoy this second part of the interview with Beau.
Yeah, so from like a young age, I knew that I wanted to help people. One of the earliest memories that I have, and my parents, of course, made me aware of this as well. But I wrote a short story, and it was called "The Boy Who Could,"
Hmm.
and it was about a boy in a wheelchair who was going to school, and they were playing basketball, and he wasn't being included in the activities, right? Because he was in a wheelchair, and so the kids just kind of dismissed him and felt like he couldn't join in or something. And he ended up eventually becoming part of the group and scoring baskets and playing basketball. And the reason that I bring that up is because it just from a young age, I was really drawn to helping people live better lives. I didn't know what I was going to do with that ultimately. My dad was a substance use counselor for a number of years, and he was just always, for lack of a better way to put this, like social work minded. You know, he just had that way of being about him where he cared. He cared about other people. He wanted other people's lives to improve, and I think that really rubbed off on me. Started going to school shortly after I got to Duluth, which is where I went through a halfway house and started my recovery journey. I started going to school, got accepted to the College of Saint Scholastica, which for me, a high school dropout, and didn't successfully complete a military stint. For me, that was a big deal. Saint Scholastica is a pretty prestigious school up on the Iron Range or up north. And so the way I was able to do that is by becoming involved in a collegiate-based recovery program that they had to offer called the Clean program. And so I ended up getting to know the founder or the person that developed this program and was one of the first students that enrolled in that program and was able to get accepted despite having this stuff on my record and having my past. He was able to get me into this school, and I just started taking classes, exploring. I was looking at psychology versus social work. Ultimately just chose the social work path. During that time, I was into Buddhism and knew I wanted to dedicate my life to that. I was actually ready to move to a different country if I needed to find a real teacher. But I found one in Minneapolis that really resonated with me. And so I knew I wanted to move to Minneapolis, and I ended up applying to a couple different schools, got into Augsburg here in Minneapolis, and went into their social work program for my bachelor's, and then that's basically where it took off. A good friend of mine, Dr. Friends, who was our old medical director at Allina, I think he kind of had the idea of providing virtual care to prescribe medications to people who needed medication assisted treatment, which is medications like Suboxone and naltrexone and other things for alcohol. But he was prescribing basically on an outpatient basis virtually to patients in the community. And so he started doing that out of New Ulm for a while. And then at a certain point, he realized that he needed like a partner in crime, somebody to help him with the therapy aspect of what he was doing. So he wanted a partner. And I knew Dr. Friends for a number of years before that, and it was just really appealing to me. I won't go into the whole backstory, but it was a period of time where I was ready to look for something else professionally, And so when this job was posted, it got brought up to my attention from my leader at the time, our old director, and just basically said, "Yeah, I think you'd be a good fit for this position." And when I found out Dr. Friends was the one doing this, and he was looking for a therapist and this new type of service he was thinking about, I was all on board with it. And so Dr. Friends and I basically started working together and developing this new type of service, which was all virtual. I was very skeptical at first. I was very much about in person care. and I didn't know how providing the service virtually was going to be. Several years later, I can tell you that I'm very pleasantly surprised and happy with providing virtual care.
Yeah, how does it help people who might otherwise fall through the cracks?
First of all, being able to provide care virtually breaks down barriers of like geographical barriers, right? And so people can receive care from sitting in their home, on their couch at home, from a smartphone. They can pull up and have a therapist right there. And I meet with people sometimes in their cars, not make sure they're not driving, but they're parked in a car. So I think the geographical barriers it breaks down, the gaps in care. Traditionally in addiction services, there's been the outpatient treatment. If you are part of an outpatient treatment program, you have to dedicate a certain number of hours, several nights a week, to be involved in the program. There's lower levels of care that isn't always the case, but for the most part, it's a couple hours, a couple nights per week. That isn't always going to meet. People aren't always able to do that. And so this is more like a therapy service where they meet with a person for 45 minutes at a time, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer. And it's right, and we're able to meet them wherever they're at. And so there's a whole swath of people that aren't able to access traditional treatment programs for a variety of different reasons that I think are much more able to participate in something like this.
Yeah, I've struggled with the intensive outpatient level of care. Sometimes just thinking as the counselor, what am I going to talk about? Spending 12 hours a week or more in group therapy with the same people. And it's on me to kind of come up with and keep it fresh. And there is a curriculum, but it tends to be, you can kind of find your own things. It's just a lot of hours for people to commit to.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of patients decline that level of care because of that.
Yeah, it's a lot, and not everybody needs that, And I certainly don't want to put down that level of care. Other levels of care are super helpful and important, But this, I really feel like this is something that was needed in our levels of care, and so I think it definitely meets a need.
And the Medicare piece, which we really have a hard time finding anything that is covered. Addiction treatment isn't easily reimbursed with Medicare. And the virtual addiction care for social workers like you, licensed social workers, it's able to reimburse for that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So the Medicare population, that's a huge benefit. I mean, this is like a service that we're able to reach that population who otherwise wouldn't have options for treatment. A lot of the patients that I meet with actually are older and are on Medicare, and they wouldn't have other options. And I shouldn't say no other options, but their options are so limited that it seems like they basically are in a position where they couldn't access care if something like this didn't exist.
Yeah, so just that is a game changer. I think 30 minutes a week of anything is a lot, so it adds up over time. If you do a 1 hour commitment every week, it is a lot to show up for once a week. And so just having that virtual addiction care piece for Medicare patients that otherwise would fall through the cracks, I think is really helpful. That's a whole generation of people that
Yeah, well, I know that it's going to be opened up. If it hasn't already, I think in the near future it's going to open up so it's not just social work that can bill for these services. But yeah, I think it's an important addition to the addiction services spectrum for sure. My dad was. I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that I didn't grow up in a house with substances in it. So what I mean by that is I knew my dad was sober. He didn't drink alcohol. We didn't have alcohol around the home. We didn't have drugs around the home.
Coffee?
Well, no, there wasn't coffee.
Oh, there was no caffeine in your home?
No, Mountain Dew.
Okay.
Actually, my dad was a pretty avid Mountain Dew drinker.
Oh, you're a family of addicts.
Yeah.
There's so many drugs in that home. Just kidding.
And nicotine.
Okay. Yeah.
But not alcohol or other drugs, And so growing up, that's what I was used to. I was used to not seeing alcohol or other substances like that around the home, other than, of course, the cigarettes and the Mountain Dew. Um, but at the age of like 12 or 13, which ironically is when I started using substances, my dad relapsed. And so for about a year period, he fell into a pretty deep relapse with alcohol. And I actually had to move from living with my dad to living with my mom in Brooklyn Center. And that was a major thing in my life, you know? And so I watched my dad turn from this like loving, caring, kind person who was heavily involved in my life, sports from a young age, all that stuff, to this like person who was angry, you know, abusive, and it scared me, and it was shocking to see that change in my dad. And so, you know, he finally ended up getting sober after about a year, and from that experience, ever since then, it changed my whole life, basically. And I became leery, and kind of like I was walking on eggshells in our house. It felt like a really different home environment than I grew up in. And so from that point on, he sobered up for a little while, but then he fell back into substance use with pills. He had degenerative disc disease, and so he had a bad back. His discs in his back were slowly deteriorating, and with that came pain. And he was prescribed medications that he ultimately became very addicted to. I didn't know this at the age when this really started to happen until later on in my life, where I became very aware that he was taking these really potent opiates and became addicted to them. And that when I learned that really like I was able to see how this was impacting his life. And what I came to learn about my dad and his own recovery journey is that in his experience of being an addiction counselor, it's almost like he got this mentality of, I know it all. You know, I know all about recovery. I know how to stay sober. And it's like this intelligence trap where because he felt like he knew it all already, he wasn't able to actually do it, you know. And so he cut himself off from the world of recovery. Um, and I think that was a major hindrance to him, you know. And so when I got into recovery myself, I embraced the fellowship part of it, and I have tried to be intentional about not thinking that I know it all with recovery, you know. And that's been a big part of my life and what shaped me today. And the other part is actually staying sober, you know, realizing the impact that my dad's substance use had on me, especially during that period of time when he relapsed and after that. The importance of a parent staying sober if they have an addiction issue is vital. And I have a daughter now, and the most important thing that I can do as a father for my daughter is to stay sober, you know, and like that's not optional to me, you know, and I know that if at any point if I return to active substance use, that is going to have a direct negative impact on my daughter, you know.
I am in your class, and we're reading Mountains and Waters by Dogen at the Dharma Fields. And I just wanted to ask about how the study of Zen and being a teacher of Zen affects your life, the quality of your life in general.
Becoming a Zen monk has given me a sense of purpose. And so when I talk about this stuff, I have to talk about it from a relative perspective because I don't want to go off in the deep end with philosophy. Or it's not philosophy, but it will sound like that. Just generally speaking, I think having a practice with meditation gives me a sense of purpose. It gives me something to do, even though it's not really doing anything. It's sitting on a cushion, right? But it's a regularity in my life. It's like it grounds my entire life. So I have a steady meditation practice that I do no matter what's going on. with some caveats. Of course, if my daughter is sick, if something happens, like I'll skip meditation practice, but I have a steady and stable meditation practice that I don't miss just because I don't feel like waking up. Like I wake up and I go do the meditation. That's essential. That's a central part of a steady or a solid meditation practice. And so it also, going a little bit deeper, it doesn't I'm better able to catch myself in the narratives that I tell myself on a regular basis. And so when I'm in the regular frame of mind, it's like that's your regular education, your regular knowledge about the world. This is relative. We call this relative. I'm better able to notice when I'm caught in maybe a cognitive distortion, is what we would say in therapy. So I'm just better able to catch myself in those moments and not feed into those storylines. Mountains and Waters has really highlights the intersection of relative and absolute. And so it's a very key teaching in Zen, is these two realities that are not two. They're not separate. But in the normal way that we approach things, they appear separate. And this really brings out that they're not separate, and that we're always within the mountains and waters. We're not separate. And this can tie into taking better care of the environment, for example. Well, if we realize that we're intimately connected with all beings, we're probably going to treat things a little bit differently, with a little bit more love and compassion. And so that's, I think, from a relative perspective, what those teachings bring out. And for me personally, this has given me the opportunity to really take a deep dive into Dogen's work, which is very hard to study and practice ultimately.
Japan at the turn of the last millennium. That is definitely some esoteric type material to work with.
Yeah.
I've been driving around thinking like everything's a delusion, nothing is real. And I guess that's the message that I'm getting, is any thoughts that I might have or judgment of any situation in my life is kind of a temporary delusion, and I'm choosing to perceive it that way. But removing all judgment allows my life to be really objective. And then it's sort of, I don't know and I can't know exactly the nature of my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and it's that word delusion, and it's kind of tricky because we say all thoughts are delusion, but that doesn't mean that they're not relatively true and real, right? So the stories and the basic frameworks, the relative frameworks that we have, are relatively true. So it's like we have to abide by the rules of our society, for example. We have to move out of the way of the bus when it's coming at us. So those things are relatively true. We can't overlook those things, but they're not ultimately true. Like, things don't exist on their own, separate and apart from the rest of reality, which is our common basic delusion, is that we think things are separate and apart. But that's overlooking the other aspect of reality, which is that everything's intimately connected in a way that you can't even say that they're connected because they weren't separate to begin with. And so there's this underlying totality or wholeness that we overlook because of our thinking, basically, and because of consciousness, ultimately, which is the dividing of an otherwise seamless whole. And so when we're caught by the consciousness, basically, or the function of mind is what we would call it, when we're caught by that way of looking at things, we don't see the world. We don't see this whole other aspect of reality that's always here and now, right? And so back to what you originally stated, it doesn't mean that the contents of our thought are always necessarily wrong. They might be relatively true and accurate, but ultimately they're never true and accurate, right? But only relatively. And even within the relative world, we can have a wrong idea about something that doesn't actually match relative reality. It's not helpful for us.
Yeah, we can kind of get lost in our heads, but we can always fall. It's kind of comforting to think we can always fall back on or fall into the here and now
Mm-hmm.
and this thing that we all share, this presence. And in some way, it feels similarly to when, like in AA, they told me to trust God or seek my higher power. It's almost like the same feeling.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that, and it's you know, one of the core teachings of Buddhism is impermanence, right? That everything changes. And it can be a little bit uneasy to realize that at first. But if we can rest in the fact that nothing's permanent, that everything is changing continuously, there's a real freedom in that we often overlook. And just like you said, trust fall, you know, back into reality or wholeness. It's like that's always the backdrop of our experience. It's not even the backdrop, it's at the foreground. We just don't notice it because we're so caught up in the stories we're telling ourselves.
Reality with a capital R.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I like that. Can you remind me again what capital R means?
Yeah, so that's basically just talking about the relative and absolute. So this is the two truths in Zen. And so relative truth is like, my name is Beau Elkington. I have a home. You know what I mean? I work a certain job. I have an identity. All that kind of all that's relatively true. But it's not absolutely true. Absolute is like where there's nothing. There's no separation between anything. And so it's like the absolute nature of reality where nothing's separate and apart. And this extends to the entire universe and all of reality with a capital R. There's not a whole lot that we can say about it other than it's not one and it's not two. And the reason we say that is because, relatively speaking, it looks like separation. We see distinct things when we experience this reality through our consciousness, or through consciousness, I should say. It's not yours or mine. But ultimately, we can't say it's one either because there's separation. There appears to be separation. And so we say there appears to be separation, but that's not ultimately true and real, you know? And we can't ultimately say it's all one because there appears to be separation. So we say it's not two. Ultimately, it's not two. And that's all we can say.
Do you have any thoughts on what's going on these days with social media and experimenting with drugs and young people?
I'm always hesitant to get in the area of good and bad. You know, is social media good? Well, yeah, I think there's some benefits. You know, I was able to communicate with my family members over long distances. That's helpful. You know, just touch base every once in a while. Connect with friends that I haven't seen in a long time. All that kind of stuff is kind of helpful, right? But then there's a downside where people can get substances online. They can find avenues of things that might not be so helpful, you know. And it's like at the end of the day, where there's a market, right? There's going to be supply and demand. And so you have people that want to sell substances and get a profit, and there's people that you can lure in and get them to buy those substances. And it seems like social media is just a platform to make those transactions easier for people. So I don't know. I don't know ultimately what the solution is or anything like that, but I think there's definitely a problem there.
That's what I've been trying to get people to think about when I go do public speaking with the No Pill Can Kill campaign. And it's similar in energy to the DARE thing. And I want to get them really curious about where the demand is coming from.
Yeah.
Why is there so much demand? And the demand is coming from inside the house. It's in our culture. It's in it. If there were no demand, there wouldn't be an opioid crisis.
Yeah. True. You know, and so I think raising awareness like that is super important. Education, I think that's a fundamental piece to the what's the right word for this? At the front end, like the getting people not to engage in substance use. Prevention. Yeah, thank you. I couldn't think of the word.
Yeah, I love prevention as a part of the roles of kind of an addiction counselor purpose.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult, complex kind of thing, though, because, I mean, if you do it the way I do it, which is kind of to look at the culture of belonging in high school or middle school, even, and cool, and kind of that's sort of the motivation underneath a lot of people's drug experimentation and heavy drinking here in Minnesota. Like, I hear a lot about really heavy drinking and among very underage people,
Yeah.
in schools and stuff. And it's kind of the cool thing to do at a house party is to get blood alcohol poisoning.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and there's a social aspect of that and a sense of belonging, that it's like it makes it easier to socialize in a lot of ways, and it's like being part of something. And yeah, I don't know what the remedy is for that stuff, you know? Um, yeah, it's beyond me. I know that for me, it comes back to the things that I can do to have some sort of impact on that. And it's things like starting new meetings or being a part of new recovery stuff and ultimately staying sober myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's actually the one area that I try to convey to people that I'm meeting with as patients, where it's especially if they're parents themselves, like the best thing that somebody can do if there's a substance use issue is take care of their own recovery. And it's like that has a profound impact on our whole society. Is just staying so like being in recovery ourselves. And I'm very open about my recovery. I don't hide the fact that I'm in recovery. I'm not ashamed of it. And from my perspective, it's something to be celebrated.
Yeah, definitely. And if we can be people that are perceived as cool for young people, it's part of why I dyed my hair pink for the cover. If we can be perceived in some way as, and having these conversations can be perceived as trendy for young people, maybe, they'll take it from me that what my body's been through because of alcohol and alcohol poisoning for years, just take it from me. You don't want to put your body through that.
Yeah.
But it can absorb a lot of poison for sure. Our human bodies are very strong.
Yeah, I think it does have a pretty significant impact. I'm always leery of like telling people what to do, especially kids, because it's like if you tell a child don't do this, what's the first thing that they want to do?
They're going to try it at some
Exactly.
point, or they'll be curious about it.
Exactly. So I just get the sense that the right approach isn't to say no, don't do this, but like maybe it's okay if you um get exposed to this. Hopefully we can give you the tools to navigate that in a productive way. I get the sense that being supportive regardless is probably the right approach. And for sure not saying no, you can't do this, but like, hey, this is what you need to be aware of. Seems like it's more like a better approach to me. So I think we've come a ways, and when I think of this, I think of it in terms of like the Minnesota model, right? The Minnesota model is basically structured around people in AA, basically, or like recovery themselves, and having treatment structured around that type of format. And it's basically like a way to get people connected to the AA community. Okay. I think that's what I think of in terms of like the origin of addiction treatment. And I think we've come a little bit a ways from that, in the sense that some treatment programs are not modeled after strictly AA, the 12-step model. Okay. And so I think, in terms of that, integrating mental health into treatment programming, I think has come a little ways from the original Minnesota model, in the sense that you have more duly licensed therapists working in programming. They're able to identify, mental health issues that are connected with addiction, right? I think we've made a little progress. I think we have a long ways to go, in the sense that people talk about person-centered care, right? And so what that means to me in terms of programming is that one size does not fit all, right? So you want to tailor the treatment to the individual. And so it's hard to do that within a program. And that's basically where the counselor comes in, or the therapist, and working with the patient in terms of like where they're currently at, getting a good understanding, versus it's all about just complete abstinence from substances, which is great. But that's not necessarily taking the whole scope of a person's life into consideration.
What have you seen works best for people in treating addiction in terms of like interventions or styles or?
Yeah, interesting question. And I think that's really relevant to my current position, doing the work that I do, which is in virtual addiction care. What's unique about our approach to addiction care is that we can truly meet people where they're at, And what I mean by that is harm reduction, I guess, versus abstinence. Even though I'd like to say that I don't think they're two different things. I think abstinence is on one far end of the spectrum of harm reduction, but in the common use of those terms, I think people think abstinence is opposed to harm reduction, and I don't think that's necessarily true.
They're not at war with each other.
Right, they're not at war with each other. I think the two are completely compatible. But because we're not necessarily an abstinence-based program, if somebody comes to me and says, I can identify a problem with my drinking, but I don't see a problem with the marijuana use, right? I can say, okay, your goal is to moderate your drinking, maybe, and maybe at one point you're able to abstain from drinking if that's your goal. But I can actually say that. I don't have to say, well, you have to be abstinent while you're in this program. I can work with people as they're going through the trials and tribulations of their substance use. And I think that's super helpful because people are going to make, they're going to run into issues with their substance use. Maybe not, Either way, I can roll with them as they're going through that process. That's been the most helpful thing, I think, in terms of addiction treatment that I've seen, is the ability to walk with people as they are going through the stages of change, I suppose you could call it.
And this is different than other outpatient treatment programs?
Yeah, I think traditional outpatient programs are really abstinence-based. And so the minute that you walk in the door, you're forced to stop using substances,
Even if other substances haven't been a problem, like maybe medical marijuana or something?
Correct, yeah. Yeah, and so I think with that model, I don't want to put it down too much because I think that has some value. But if you're made to make changes that you're not ready to make from the beginning, that can creep up on the back end of treatment or even during treatment. I mean, if a person's not ready to make the changes, they're not ready. But being able to like walk with them as they're, figuring out if there's a problem and if they're ready to make those changes has real therapeutic value. So I have many patients that I've worked with where they come in and they're on the fence. They don't know if they want to quit using the substance that they've identified as potentially being a problem. And so being able to talk with them about their substance use as they're continuing to use substances can be helpful. More often than not, there's a conflict between what they value in their life, and their substance use. Right? Like if they identify family as being very important to them, right? And they're continuing to use substances, well, we're going to have conversations about how is using substances in line with your value of family. How does this impact your family? Does it impact your family? And having the patient be able to verbalize like where some of those conflicts are is super helpful, and so it's for the patient to arrive at their own conclusion whether or not they want to do something about their substance use. And I think that's super important because I've been in recovery for quite a while as well, and I know this pretty much for sure, that if a person isn't fully committed to make the change, it's not going to stick, Like there needs to be like an inherent motivation that comes from within the person for that change to sustain over time. Like people can maybe quit for a while to appease probation or whatever, but at some point, and that's not wrong. Like I'm not saying you have to engage in treatment only if it's for your own reasons, but eventually there's a shift that needs to happen where they can identify abstinence or a change to their substance use as being something that they want, you know?
Yeah, that sounds pretty revolutionary, and I wonder how much the need to be off all intoxicants comes from a story, like a classic alcoholic that needs to quit drinking type story of the person that needs to go to rehab. But AA is the oldest model, and AA is the that kind of the structure for the foundation of the Minnesota model of addiction treatment, which has been around the longest. And I wonder how much that story of kind of quitting drinking and the pressure, the desire to like pull everyone into one narrative of recovery is responsible for why we can't, or why it is so revolutionary today to look at addiction treatment the way that you do.
Are you talking about me specifically?
No,
Just as a
I
whole?
think like in general, I also kind of think religious organizations fall into this pitfall of I've had this awakening, I have come to Jesus, and so everyone needs to come with me into that experience, and we all need to pressure to share that experience. And maybe it's because it helps religious people validate their spiritual experiences so that they can, instead of feeling alone in that, they feel together in one story, in one narrative. And so I wonder about that pressure to conform to one narrative, that also that very human urge to kind of share an experience with someone. I think that we fall into this pitfall that everyone's having the same experience, so everyone needs to get off all intoxicants in order to be in recovery, even though maybe it was just one substance that they were really struggling with in the trap of.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're onto something there, and that kind of hits the nail on the head is in terms of how, for example, the Minnesota model came to be what it is, and there's some beliefs in AA. I don't want to single out AA, that's not my intention here, but I think there's some beliefs, and there's some beliefs about the disease of addiction, that may or may not be accurate, and it's always that question about, well, where does the disease, is it a disease, first of all? That's always a debate. And then if we look at it from that lens, where did it come from? Is it nature? Is it nurture? And that's a question that people often struggle with, and I know one of the central kind of beliefs in AA is that abstinence is the only solution that we have to offer for alcoholism, like not drinking, which I don't debate. I don't think that's wrong necessarily, because I do think that if you have a problem with drinking, it causes consequences in your life. If you quit drinking, you're going to cease to have problems as a result of drinking. So it makes sense, but it overlooks people making the trials and tribulations that they need to arrive at that conclusion, right? And this is actually contrary to what it says in the big book about, like abstaining from drinking and having to abstain from drinking. They say, and I'm going to get this off because it's been a while since I've looked at it, but if you're not, convinced that you need to stop drinking, then go drink. Try it out and see how it goes.
Right.
And so the work that I do is very much in line with that. Like, hey, if you're not ready to stop, it's like, keep drinking. That's fine. I'm not going to shun you because you continue to drink. If you are a problematic substance user, you can find that out for yourself. You don't need me to tell you that, even though I can diagnose you and all that kind of stuff. In order for it to actually like hold or stick, in order to make the changes that you're looking for, you have to be convinced yourself,
And you're seeing good results with that.
For sure. Yeah. No, I don't have the statistics in front of me. But I can tell you that I'm really satisfied with the results that I'm seeing doing this work. And I have worked with a lot of people in this format where they've arrived at their own conclusion with, of course, help from me, or the therapy, the group in general, in order to arrive at their own conclusion.
Well, that does it for Beau Elkington. And next week, we're going to have Joe Caravella on the show. He is a legend, a legendary Hazelden counselor. Really excited to have him on the show. Send me any questions or comments that you'd like at setyourselffreepod@gmail.com. While I help kind of build this podcast by interacting with you, the audience. In the meantime, I challenge you to set yourself free from anything that stops you from self-actualizing and becoming the best, most authentic version of you.